You're looking good, and it feels good to be with you today. I'm Kendall Brian Hunter, author of this book, Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. My tablet just slipped. Okay, so I screwed up the joke. Here's a joke. You still working on your Valentine's Day refreshments or candy for refreshments? Yeah, it's all junk food. Don't eat it. So let me get that set up a little bit better. So today's theme is Isaiah Riot, the Isaiah Riot. But first, let me start talking about the Isaiah opportunity. This is our biennial excursion into the words of Isaiah. We do the Old Testament. 2 years later, we do the Book of Mormon with the small excerpts. And here and there, we have chapters that quote from Isaiah, notably Jesus Christ. And it becomes a minefield. It's I'm going to talk a little about that a little bit today, why Isaiah is so difficult to understand. But think about our approach to Isaiah in the church. Well, first of all, think about Jesus Christ's approach to Isaiah as you read 3rd Nephi. This complete bombarding us with Isaiah. There's something to Isaiah that he wants us to know and to understand. It's important to Jesus Christ's mission. First Vision quotes Isaiah. So that's Christ's approach to Isaiah. Now, what's our approach to Isaiah in church? Is there a difference? Why is there a difference? How do we see church? Is church really a neighborhood meeting to organize a block party? We're just getting there to socialize. Hey, let's organize a block party to have fun, and perpetual rat wheel of meeting to organize another meeting to organize an activity, meeting to organize an activity, throwing a temple trip here and there. Or is church about Jesus Christ, making covenants in communion through doctrine? And which is the best approach, and which approach involves Isaiah more? Have you ever showed up to a ward barbecue where you had a message about Isaiah? Well, why not? So, diffusing the time bomb. We have helps in diffusing the Isaiah time bomb. The Bible Dictionary, the chapter headings, the Joseph Smith translation. I have a link to Elder McConkey's article in 1973 called 10 Keys to Understanding Isaiah, and also has a list of a really small bullet list of topics that each chapter talks about. As always, I encourage people to read the Bible Dictionary first about the book of Isaiah, read the chapter headings, look through for the Joseph Smith translations in the Bible, and then you read the chapter after you do all that background information. That'll help you understand things. Then after you're done, write your own chapter headings to sum up what you've learned. So you're not kind of having things ricochet off your eardrums, reflected off your retinas. Okay, I read this. Let's move on to binge watching Runaway Bride. So having said that, let's get into the section. So it starts with a preface, not with Isaiah chapter 1, but 2 Nephi 11. And there's some scholarship that suggests that Isaiah chapter 1 wasn't written by Isaiah, which may explain why it's missing from the Book of Mormon. But what this is Nephi's preface to a small collection of Isaiah, and he explains why he's including this. Concerning all the difficulty with engraving, Jacob talks about why would he go through the trouble of recording something that's already recorded in the brass plates. And part of the reason is that Nephi and Jacob both had the second comforter. And Isaiah also had the second comforter, which we'll read about later on. So all three of these men have seen the Savior face to face as a man talketh to another person. And this experience of the second comforter is part of the gospel. And it's not something we should shy away from. And just because Denver Snuffer went Fruit Loops with it doesn't mean we drop it. It's part of the gospel. It's part of our experience. And the fact that we're not talking about it is indicative of something. It may be because we're too busy organizing block parties. So that is 2 Nephi 11, the preface, and explains why he's including it. And you have these three witnesses of Jesus Christ. And then Isaiah's he and his brother are witnesses, and then Isaiah's a third witness, as he explains. 2 Nephi 12. So I'm going to do this really kind of quick. This chapter is a very familiar one about the mountain of the Lord's house. It talks about two buildings that people gather to. One's the temple where they're taught, endowed, and governed by God's law. The other one is the caverns, the flight, the iconoclasm, smashing the idols, and people are governed by fear. And that's really what life is about, those two choices. Are we going to go to the temple, or are we going to go to our man-made caverns and hide there and smash our idols because we're afraid of what's going on? We were horsing around with the church and not taking things seriously. There's two footnotes in this chapter which are really interesting for verse 2 and then verse 16. Verse 2 says, comparison with the King James Bible and the English shows that there are differences in more than half of the 433 verses of Isaiah quoted in the Book of Mormon, while 200 verses have the same wording. So you're reading something different than what you're reading in the King James Version as you read the Book of Mormon. Then they have this really kind of sneaky one in there, where he talks about Nephi is quoting Isaiah, and it talks about the ships of the sea and the ships of Tarshish. And this is what the footnote says in verse 16. The Greek Septuagint version of the Bible, which is a different translation, an earlier translation as opposed to one that we're using, has the expression ships of the sea. The Hebrew has ships of Tarshish. The Book of Mormon has both, showing that the brass plates had lost neither phrase. Okay, that's one of those sneaky things that shows that this is a translation. This is not Joseph Smith making up stuff. He didn't have access. He didn't speak Hebrew at this time. He didn't go up to the synagogue and talk to a rabbi to get some, okay, when I'm going to do this book. No, this is one of these things that you just cannot plow around. You can't explain away. You can't babble on like a chatbot. This is an evidence that the Book of Mormon is a translation of an ancient record. And that's that chapter. Chapter 13. The main theme of this chapter is social chaos. You have the breakdown of society. You have a lack of leadership. No one wants to be a leader. Kind of like nowadays. Kind of unusual people taking leadership on offices because it's really kind of crazy. And there's a lack of men, and that may be due to the wars going on, is that you have the men fight and the men get killed. The women remain behind. That happened to the Xenophites, where the Xenoph kept fighting the Lamanites, and all he did was end up with a bunch of widows. And then the chapter ends with that great chapter about the daughters of Zion. It talks about seductive clothing and also the subsequent curses. So when you read about baldness, they actually may be a reference to slavery, according to Victor Ludlow in his commentary on Isaiah, that as you'd capture a slave, you'd shave her head or shave his head to one that gets head lice under control, but also you're easy to spot a runaway slave. The other chapter, Isaiah uses the expression burning instead of beauty. J.B. Phillips translates that branding instead of beauty. Branded like some cattle. That's not pleasant. It has to do with the very lustful thoughts that the daughters of Zion are having, and focusing on fashion and allurement of clothing, and it brings these curses upon us. You ever heard a talk on chastity, and, or I should say modesty, and for the young woman? And did they ever quote this chapter? What about Isaiah's warning about nose rings in this chapter? Something going on? Are we mangling something here? Now, 2 Nephi 14, the next chapter, the last verse of the previous, the first verse of 2 Nephi 14 is actually the last verse of the previous chapter in the Joseph Smith translation. That's where it makes a little bit more sense, for 7 women take hold of 1 man. And no, I'm not going to comment on polygamy. But what happens is that this chapter talks about the filthiness of the daughters of Zion, but it talks about their cleansing and their repentance. And that you always teaching, okay, here's the problem and here's the solution. You just don't leave it at the problem. You always talk about both aspects of it. This chapter talks about order in the family, and that every home will become a temple. Now, think about this. And the Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion, and upon her assemblies, a cloud and a smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For upon all the glory of Zion shall be a defense. In every dwelling place will have a pillar of, it harkens back to the image of the tabernacle of Moses, where you have a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But that's happening upon every dwelling home. And it's like what we're doing now. We're doing home-centered church supported. where we're backing off or we're reining the church in. Families do not exist to serve the church. Church exists to serve the families. That we're not seeing families as a human resources department. Okay, new family moved into the war. Let's give them this calling, that calling, the other calling, this other calling to run all these programs and to organize all these board activities for us. No, it's a shifting of the homes for the training and the teaching. It's great with this "Come Follow Me" as we're shifting it back to the families, having moms and dad teaching the children, not expecting someone else to teach them or to supplant the parents. There's benefits and there's wisdom to it. And it's this Isaiah prophecy is talking about that. So 2 Nephi 15, it talks about a parable which reminds us of Jacob 5 and also Doctrine and Covenants section 101, starting around verse 43, about someone who has a vineyard and how they take care of it and what happens. This chapter talks about having frustrations with your calling. What more could I have done? Isaiah chapter 53, who hath believed our report? Who's believed us? As we sent out, as you were a missionary, did people pay attention to you? You may have had success as a missionary. Isaiah was not a successful person. This chapter also talks about people calling good evil and evil good. That's everything you see on TV. That's everything you read in the newspaper. Everything you see on social media is calling evil good and good evil. People writing extensive and heavily footnoted books attacking prophets, and members of the church are falling for these attacks. People just reading the CES letter, and they act like it's the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. I have read the CES letter, so I left the church. Use some critical thinking and do your own research. It's a lot of work. But I've read the Book of Mormon 133 times, and I've read every single conference report. I've read every single volume of the Joseph Smith paper. Okay? You have to do your own independent thinking and research, and quoting from the CES letter over and over again just doesn't cut it. So this chapter is funny. I like this expression: people who follow strong drink, the harp and the viol, or the veal. They're getting drunk and listening to music. That's MTV. It's been doing it for decades now. But this chapter also talks about the gathering of Israel. 2 Nephi 16, we're going through this really quick. We're about 12 minutes. If I'm going too slow for you, you just play this at double speed on YouTube. So 2 Nephi 16 has Isaiah's vision. It's his calling. Isaiah is cleansed. He's unclean lips. And he gets the call extended. Who shall I send? Here am I, send me. It's not just Jesus Christ, it's Isaiah. In fact, it's everyone said, here am I, send me. That's about your foreordained mission. It was, here am I, send me. Then he explains why Isaiah is so difficult. Well, first of all, back this is Isaiah talking about having the second comforter and this vision of the premortal existence. So this qualifies him as a witness of Christ, this seeing the Savior as with Nephi and Jacob. Like I said, it's part of the gospel, and don't plow around it because people have gone crazy with it. But why is Isaiah difficult? It says this: go and tell this people, hear ye indeed, but they understood not, and see ye indeed, but they perceived not. Make the heart of this people fat, and make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and be converted and healed. So that's spoken a little bit ironically about what's happening is you're having people who are just closing their eyes to prophets. I'm not sure if this exactly applies to this, but Jacob chapter 4, verse 14. Jacob says, they were a stiff-necked people, and they despised the words of plainness, and they killed the prophets, and they sought for things they could not understand. Wherefore, because of their blindness, which blindness comes by looking beyond the mark. You send someone like Amos, who's a farmer. He's not a prophet, not a son of the prophets. Talks plain to them. They hate him. And so you get Isaiah, who has this very ornate Maxwellian way of expressing things. And people, this is confusing. It's like, okay, you're just making up excuses. Christ talked about that. He says, about they're like little children, play the pipe and they're dancing and you haven't danced, and we sung a dirge and you haven't mourned with us. People just playing games with the church, and these clever defense mechanisms and avoidance tactics to taking the gospel seriously. And that's where charity comes in, is you really need to deeply love these people to get past the defense mechanisms. 2 Nephi 17, Christ and the chaos. And this, you're reading about war, Isaiah's involvement in the wars. He was a part of the court of the king. He was a vizier, kind of like Jafar, except he was good, vizier, and so he's involved with this, but he's also a prophet at the time. And this reminds us of the 14 fundamentals of the prophet. Fundamental number 10 is that the prophet can be involved in civic matters, and Isaiah was heavily involved in politics. 2 Nephi 18. Now we're going back to families again. And remember, each chapter sometimes is a different topic. Each verse can go from topic to topic. 2 Nephi 18. Isaiah and his children, his wife and his children, and we had Isaiah's wife is mentioned here. She's called the prophetess, were signs and wonders to Israel. That his marriage was symbolic, like Hosea's in the Old Testament, of marriage of God to his covenant people. The children were promises and warnings to people. It's the question, is it literal or figurative? Well, it's both. It's Isaiah really had a family, and these families were symbols in the same way with the sacrament, bread and water. It's literal bread and water, but it's representative of something. This chapter also has warning about the wizards and the occult. And think about how we use occult as entertainment. For a while, when Heber J. Grant was a little kid, back in the 1890s, there was a fad of spiritualism in Salt Lake City, and he talked about it in general conference. People using placents and communing with spirits, table wrappings, that type of stuff. But for our day, what about the TV shows we watch, the fantasy shows we watch? And for members of the church who are authors, when you write fantasy, are you being very clear that magic and wizardry and the occult are really bad things and they're not symbolic? And I know that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis understood it a little bit differently, but are we being true to the doctrine about the occult practices? So chapter 19, this is the last chapter. Once again, we have Christ and the chaos. There's weirdness going on, wars, societal breakdown, last days, end times type of thing. And it talks about, it has this verse about leaders causing us to err. And of course, we're talking about apostate leaders. But what about local leaders who go off beam and go off track and don't follow the rules and start adding aberrations to the church? And it sets a bad precedent. So someone thinks, oh, this leader did something bad, so that means it's really okay. Think about how you're introducing aberrations into the church. So that's the chapters as best I could sum up things. The themes, the apocalyptic contrast, good and bad, light and darkness, temples and caverns. Christ, you have a choice between Christ or chaos. And also the aspect of the premortal calls, the effort, but also the mortal failure. You read that as that some of these prophets actually failed. Ezekiel talks about that. Isaiah talks about that. Elijah, about the frustrations with the callings. So it's not all glorious or not all success. There are legitimate frustrations. This is common to all prophets. Think about all those times you tried to send up home teaching appointments with people and they kept throwing sand in your face. That's part of the fellowship of being a servant of Christ, is when that happens to you. So that kind of sums us up. I went a little bit light because we have to approach Isaiah line upon line, precept upon precept. And each time you hear something good about Isaiah, it nudges you closer to goodness. So I hope I did that with this podcast, just saying, okay, here's some good things. Let's get you a little bit closer to Isaiah and what he's talking about. But here's the Christ quotient. Our attitudes towards Isaiah are part of the problem. I remember about 20 years ago, I was attending a single student ward, and we had a class that was taught by a member of the stake presidency. So I appreciated the sacrifice he made for the calling and the time he took out to teach the class. But he began with one of those Isaiah jokes. That's a bad way to start a class, because you're making fun of the words of a prophet. I bet if I'd gotten up and if I was asked to speak in general conference and I made fun of his words, the sermon he preached, I would have gotten a lot of trouble. But this member of the stake presidency thought it was okay to make some jokes about Isaiah's words. Okay, that's part of the problem. I understand it's a way to diffuse tension, but don't ridicule a prophet. That's not how you're going to solve the problem. It's having a Christ-like attitude towards the word of Isaiah. That if we have to do our homework and do some research, maybe read and reread this over again, maybe show God, say, okay, look, I'm going to take the 66-day challenge. So for the next 66 days, I'm going to read one chapter of Isaiah each day and then see what happens. Why are we doing this? Because Isaiah is a witness of Jesus Christ. And getting a witness of Jesus Christ, that testimony, that's the point.